Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good middle of the night, wherever you are. Lovely to see you. Thank you for the wave there, Lottie. Thank you so much. Thank you there, Kay. Thank you, John. You're all waving in one after the other now. It's lovely. Thank you so much. What a nice welcome. And as always, thank you for joining me during the middle of the day, if it is your middle of the day. I'm in, where am I? Near Bangkok. So it's 6 hours ahead of the UK. I'm at 7 o'clock here. So I really, really appreciate you. Excuse me. I really appreciate you being here for your lunchtime. If that's where you are. I'll only be keeping you a shortish time today. I think I was looking through this talk, and I actually feel it's going to be relatively brief, which is probably a good thing because I was thinking about the experience of time we have, and when you're delivering a lecture, delivering a presentation or a talk, it goes really fast. I don't know how many of you give talks and so on, but it seems to disappear very fast. But I think when you're listening, it can feel quite slow because you're like, just get to the point, Bolton, or whoever that presenter is. And so I'm going to try to actually, hopefully, give you the experience of this being a somewhat shorter presentation today. At the same time, we've got quite a decent amount to get through. So I won't hesitate to get started, other than to say this. First of all, we've got Ruth Randall. I don't know if you can see her on the screen. Ruth Randall's in charge today. She'll be letting people in the room. Also, if I stop for questions, Ruth will be the one that essentially unmutes you or mutes you or whatever, whatever we do with that sort of thing. So Ruth is the boss today. We should be about an hour, I think, in total, including some reflections and questions. And I think that should be fine to get through the content of today. As I say, I will stop for questions occasionally, but not too often. There are sort of three major chunks, and we'll just go through them and see where we get to. How does that sound? All good? Thumbs up? Wonderful. Oh, wow. Look at all those thumbs. Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, if you don't know who I am, I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder of Animas Centre for Coaching and the founder of the International Centre for Coaching Supervision. If you've never come across me before, I'm a little bit obsessed by the philosophy of coaching and what it means to be human, particularly to be human in the 21st century, which is, of course, the thing we've been thrown with, as Heidegger would say. We've been thrown into the 21st century. Sadly, none of you can tell me what it's like to be a human in the 16th century because you're alive with me today, but which is in itself a fascinating aspect of the experience of time. But we won't be going into historicity today. We are very much going into the experience of the flow of time. But that's who I am. I essentially, my brain goes in weird circles around ideas as it relates to coaching. And that's why today we're going to be talking about the phenomenology of time in transformative coaching. Now, this is a funny one for me because I actually this was my first ever lecture back in 2015. I don't know if any of you came to it. Ruth, I wonder if you came to it. But 2015, I did a lecture called Time and Timelessness in Coaching. And it was really exploring precisely what we're going to look at today, including Philip Zimbardo's Paradox of Time. But I thought it was worth revisiting all these years later to see how my own thoughts around it have changed, but also how it might reinform you guys today. So let me get to my presentation. Let's get cracking, shall we? One of the joys of doing presentations nowadays, have I shared it, is creating images. I love creating images for these slide decks. It's a lot of fun. So I hope you appreciate them because a lot of work goes into these amazing images now. And here we go. Time as lived, not measured. The phenomenology of time in transformative coaching. And, time has always been a really interesting thing for me. I have a completely polar opposite perspective on time than my father does. And I've always been fascinated by that. My father lives in the past, like totally in the past. It's incredible how much he remembers about his childhood, the streets he walked upon as a young boy, the girlfriend he used to date and wished he'd married. He remembers everything in infinite detail. And I've got almost barely any recollection of my childhood. I can meet somebody who was apparently a close friend, and I'm like, the name kind of feels familiar, but I don't really know who you are. It's really shocking. I sort of live in the future. And I think that's partly why I've always been very entrepreneurial, because I think entrepreneurs live in the future. We plan, we have visions, and we make things happen. But it's fascinating to me how I sprang from the same gene pool as my father, and I seem to be polar opposites. And it's always made me think about how that has shaped how we live, and how my dad has lived a certain life and I've lived a certain life, and how understanding our relationship to time and our relationship to the flow of time and where we sit in time can help us as coaches work with our clients to help them unlock certain things that maybe they're stuck with, or to accept certain things they're stuck with. One of the things I was talking about in my last lecture, if you recall, human all too human, which was essentially an exploration of the paradox of change and accepting how we are rather than how we wish we were. What I've realized is the more I accept my relationship to time, the more happily I live within that relationship to time. Whereas the more I struggle with it or push against it or think I should be in a different kind of way of thinking, the more dissatisfied I get with who I am as a person or what my life looks like. And so, especially over the last couple of years, I've really started to appreciate my approach to life and my approach to time and become very at peace with it and not challenge myself. And it's allowed for much more kind of, what would you call a sort of a settled way of living, in a way. Settled in a way that means my life is unsettled, but my mind is settled. So let's go into this presentation. The essential question I really want to address through this talk is this one. How does the way we individually experience time shape how we live our lives? How does the way we individually experience time shape how we live our lives? And I mean that in a meta sense. Like right now, we're going to experience this lecture differently. Some of you will find it slow and boring. Some of you might find it really fascinating and wow, that time just disappeared. Some of you, including me, might find that it feels tight for time. Like, wow, how did I get all this content in? That's one thing. That's like that's a momentary relationship to time. What I'm talking about is a meta relationship to time, a sort of almost like a deep psychological makeup as it relates to time. And in fact, there's if I can recommend one wonderful, wonderful paper to you that could change the way you think about coaching forever, it was the Psychology of Worldviews by, I forgot his name now, but his surname was Colt Corrivera. Interestingly enough, he's actually gone very much into the occult and conspiracy theories now, which is fascinating. But he wrote this beautiful paper called The Psychology of Worldviews, and it really unpicked every kind of aspect of what your paradigm of life might be. And one of them is relationship to time. And it really rang true for me that it's so important that we at least raise awareness of this underlying relationship to what a client might have as it relates to time. In fact, there's a wonderful story, fantastic story by, what's his name? Irvin Yalom's therapist, Rollo May, who talks about one of his patients who every night thought he was going to die. And that fear of immediate death left him in this kind of loop of timelessness. It was a fascinating case study of how this guy could achieve nothing in life because he was convinced he was going to die every night. And it was a deep therapeutic journey he had to go on. But that's obviously an extreme example. But in a way, we all carry different versions of that at some more or less intense degree that shapes the way we think about life and the way we live our life. So I mentioned this was a throwback to my first lecture, my own fascination with time. During this talk, we're going to take a look at some what you might think of as common temporal challenges within coaching. What do we notice comes up in coaching that has a temporal element to it? We'll take a look at two conceptual models, including Husserl and Zimbardo. I want to take a look at some practical coaching approaches, and finally take a look at what you might think was the transformative impact of allowing clients to explore this. And for any of you who've been to any of my lectures, you'll probably know what this hand gesture means. I hope you can see this. I can't see any of you or myself now because I'm seeing my slideshow, but I often do this when it relates to transformative coaching, because what we're doing in transformative coaching is opening up the client's inner world of beliefs, assumptions, philosophical foundations, and we're just opening it for exploration. We don't necessarily need to create change. The very act of awareness is often a process of change in itself. And so what we're doing when we're talking about relationship to time is not necessarily shifting it or suggesting it needs to be shifted, but simply allowing the client to realize, wow, I have a relationship with time which is unique to me, which is not the same as my partner, my boss, my employees, my whoever. This is my relationship to time, and how might it be shaping how I live my life? So that's what we're going to go through now. By the way, take a moment to appreciate this beautiful art. For any of you who know artificial intelligence, this was created on Mid-Journey, and I just love creating these images that somehow symbolically talk to what I'm trying to express. I just think this is beautiful. This kind of this idea of the journey into this infinite space of time and what that could mean to us. So why does time matter in coaching? First of all, we all live through it. Let's be honest. As Heidegger says, we are thrown into our existence and we are thrown into a given time. We can't avoid it. We are embodied beings that have a historicity to us, that will live in a particular time and experience time. None of us can exist outside of time. Well, not that we're aware of. Because the problem is, if somebody did exist out of time, they couldn't even tell us because they wouldn't be part of our time paradigm. So we all live through time and we all experience it, but we experience it differently. Time itself, of course, shapes the context for our identities, our choices, our plans, our emotions. It shapes everything. And we'll go into, in a sense, why that's the case. But if you think about it, you don't make choices unless there's a future. You don't make choices for tomorrow, a year's time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. Or if you're, I think is it the Japanese that plan their business for 100 years' time? I think it is. Or there's the concept of the generational planning, like plan for 4 generations in the future. All of these are relationships to time that will impact how you think about your business or your life or your relationship. Or, if you've got children. I don't have children. I've never had children. That'd be a strange thing, wouldn't it? To have had them and then not have them. But, I've never had children, never wanted to have them. And so my life ends fundamentally with me. But if you have children, you're going to have a different relationship, I suspect, to time than I would, because you think about where your children are heading and what's going to happen to your children and so on. So time shapes the context for identity to show up, choices to show up and be made and so on. And then at the same time, of course, clients live out their stories of the past, the future, and in the moment with you, the present. But in particular, we think about coaching as an exploration of, what do they perceive for their future, but also what does the past mean to them as it relates to that future? And of course, what is the past and the projection of the future? Well, it's time. And interestingly enough, time holds different versions of ourselves, which can have different weights to them. I mentioned my dad at the start of this and how my dad, I shouldn't talk about my dad, should I? I should say a random human being. I should anonymize him, but there you go. Dad is now in the lecture. But my dad very much lives in the past and he has a vision of himself in the past. He remembers himself as a young lad. I can barely remember myself as a boy at all. I have memories, but I can't really, I don't feel an experience of Nick Bolton as a boy. I can think of kind of 3 chunks of my life. One was childhood up until I was about 21 when I got married. And then really from about the age of 30 onwards was this current life, which was when I left my first wife and started to build what I perceive as my current identity, let's say. And when I think about time as a place where I situate myself, I find it super hard to situate myself in the past. I just do not think of the past at all, hardly. Of course, we all do to some degree, but very little. And yet at the same time, we can have identities that sit in the past that we become very loyal to. And if a client's sitting in the past with a loyalty attached to that identity, this is who I've been for 20 years, how can I change myself? They're sort of stuck in a time dimension of who they were, and they have a certain loyalty to it. So one of the things we might want to do is kind of help them think about, well, where does this identity sit in the past and how do you move into an identity for the future and disconnect from this old identity that you're protecting. It's almost like people honor the person they were, the identity, the version of themselves that they were at a certain point, and they honor it and they protect it, or they corset it, or they lock it in, or whatever they do with it in order not to disregard it or challenge it or undermine it or whatever it might be. So these kind of, if you imagine a timeline, these characters sit along it and we're like, well, which one are you honoring at this point? So when we think about time in that way, we can see it has a huge significance to coaching. And if we look at some of the most, let's say, common temporal themes within coaching, one of the most obvious ones is stuck in the past. And that could be regret. It could be unresolved grief. But equally, it could be, I don't know what he means, what he could have been. It could be past glories, or it could be what he could have been. I often think about that Bruce Springsteen song, Glory Days, where he talks about not wanting to be like the people he grew up with who are stuck in the past, the guy that threw the baseball. And he all he can remember is when he was the best baseball thrower in the school, and he's like got no job, and he's like he's got nothing to hang on to apart from his memories. And there's a young girl who was the prettiest girl in the school, and now she's Bruce Springsteen talks very beautifully about this idea of the glory days and how they can hold us back from living the life we're in right now. And so when we think about being stuck in the past, we often think about trauma. We often think about the trauma of the past, but often it's not trauma. It's what was so wonderful. It was the halcyon days. It was the glory days. It was the golden age of my life. And how can I be better than that? And I'm curious, you don't need to say anything, but I'm curious for you to reflect in your own mind about what you see for yourself in the future as an identity. Do you think your best days are yet to come? Do you think your best days have gone? How do you perceive yourself? For me, I feel like my best days are yet to come. But when I was 28 and I left my first wife, I really thought that was kind of like a frozen moment in time. I was super happy to have got my freedom back. But I also thought, I remember going on a date and somebody said, and this person said to me, are you ambitious? And I said, no. I said, my ambitious days are behind me. I've been a bank manager. Well, as a retail bank manager of Abbey National. And I said, I've been a bank manager. My ambitious days are behind me. 28 years old. How could I have conceived that I wouldn't change in that time? But for a moment in time, I thought I was stuck. Whereas now I think at the age of 55, wow, best years are ahead. So, how we think about the future in terms of the level of change we can go to, what lies ahead versus what's left lies behind, all critical for coaching. Equally, we can be paralyzed by the future in different ways. We can be paralyzed by anxiety, by perfectionism, by uncertainty, good old existential uncertainty. You can only be uncertain because there is a future. If all you had was the present, there wouldn't be much uncertainty. But the fact you don't know what's coming means we're plagued by uncertainty if we allow lack of knowing to create anxiety. But nonetheless, one of the critical aspects of time is, of course, we don't know what the future holds. None of us do. I can be as optimistic as I want about the best days lie ahead, but it could all go bad tomorrow. I was in Nepal last year and I was doing a trek on Manaslu circuit and I got ill. Nothing too bad. It wasn't like altitude sickness. I just got ill and I just could not walk. I was like super, super weak and I had to get helicoptered off. But on that helicopter flight down back to Kathmandu, the pilot told me he'd taken 2 bodies down that day. One guy slipped on a section that my sister and I had crossed the day before. And then we were both like, wow, looks dangerous. It was slippy and there'd been a huge kind of landslide. And we were all going across on these poles, like, whoa, this looks dangerous. Anyway, turns out the day before this guy had fallen to his death. And another lady had died of altitude sickness at 4,500 meters, which isn't even very high. And it really struck me, my goodness me, we do not know what tomorrow holds. We get up every day assuming the day is going to be roughly okay. We assume it's going to be roughly okay. Maybe we catch a cold, or maybe we're late for a meeting, or maybe the chips we buy from the chip shop are cold, or whatever. They could be the last day you live. And that kind of sense of not knowing is so critical for understanding of time, both from a positive and a negative perspective. Does the client enjoy not knowing? Do they feel they need to know? Are they okay with not knowing? What's their relationship to not knowing is equally what's their relationship to the future. And then are they lost in the present? And that could be boredom, could be purposelessness, or it could be what I would call destructive immersion. That could be, alcoholism or drug, whatever it might be, but something that means that you're not moving forward from the past in a way that's very destructive. Of course, you can be immersed in the present in a good way. You could be immersed mindfully in the moment. But there are kinds of immersion which keep you stuck in the present. What might be called the hedonistic, what we'll come to with Zimbardo is the hedonistic present focus. Or you could be overwhelmed by urgency, the sheer idea that you have no time to reflect or breathe, no time to catch your breath and think, what am I doing in my life? I know there are very few occasions where I feel like that, but just ever so often, if I overload myself with business, usually business stuff, I'll suddenly feel this anxiety, which I very, very rarely feel anxiety. And I'll suddenly feel it. And at that point, I feel anxiety. I think, that's not anxiety, that's overwhelm. I've just given myself too much to do. Strip it back, Nick, strip it back. And that feeling of urgency, like I've got to get this all done, can really impact how we experience time. So those are some common temporal themes. Now let's start thinking about how we experience it. And we want to talk about chronos and kairos. Now, this isn't a model. It's more like just a way of thinking about time. The ancient Greeks had this concept of chronos and kairos. I'm always a little bit concerned about saying Greek words because our head of learning is Greek. She corrected me on how to say what I thought was pedagogy, which turns out to be pedagogy or something. So I'm hoping chronos and kairos is okay. Katerina, tell me if I'm wrong. Chronos and kairos, what are they? Well, chronos was what we might think of as measured time. It's quantitative, it's sequential, it's Newtonian. It's the kind of time that you measure with clocks and calendars, and it's linear. It just moves forward from past to present to future, doesn't stop, just keeps going. It's the time of schedules and deadlines and durations. And we typically measure modern life with chronos. And even if you think about coaching, we have 60 minutes today. What would you like to explore? Bang, chronos enters the room. I feel like he should have big rings and he destroys half the population with a click of the fingers, but that's not Chronos, that's somebody else, isn't it? Thanatos or something. But Chronos is all about sequential time. And you know, there's what's his name? The psychoanalyst, the French psychoanalyst, Lacan. And Lacan was famously kicked out of the American Psychoanalytic Society. I believe it was correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but the American Psychoanalytic Society Association, because he refused to play the game of 50-minute sessions. You know, typically in psychoanalysis and most therapy, it's a 50-minute session. And on 50 minutes, the therapist traditionally just goes, dum, down, we're over, get lost. Doesn't matter where you are in that journey, emotionally, mentally, cognitively, whatever. It's like 50 minutes, out you go, buddy. And Lacan didn't play that game. His concern was what needs to happen in this moment. It might take 10 minutes, it might take an hour. And because he didn't go with the Chronos version of time, he was basically disbarred from being a psychoanalyst within the traditional approach, which is why he created his own Lacanian approach, and his own society, which I think he also then got kicked out of as well for another reason. So then you have Kairos, and Kairos refers to qualitative experiential time. It relates to how you might experience it in that moment, what's opportune for you, what's right for you, or indeed what's wrong for you at that moment in time. It's felt and not measured. We'll take a look at how that might show up. But Kairos is when time seems to either stand still or stretch out, when you're in flow, in deep reflection, a turning point in life, and so on. And it's often associated with meaning, insight, or transformation. It was the right time to make a change, or that was the wrong time for it to happen to me. It's like, no, that was just a time. That was just 5:03 in the afternoon. But it doesn't feel like 5:03 in the afternoon. It feels like the wrong time for that to happen. Like, why did that happen now? That's a Kairos reflection. So when we think about Kairos experiential states, what can we think of? Well, flow states, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and his idea of the flow state, a flow state where you're perfectly in balance between challenge and optimal performance. When I don't play tennis, but I imagine when you play tennis and if you play well and if you're playing the right level of opponent, you get into this flow. I can remember having been I'm not a very good sports person, but I remember being in flow playing pool once. And it just every shot, just boom, boom, boom. I was like, how is this happening? It was pure flow, right level of opponent who was good enough to challenge me, not so good that I maybe feel incompetent. And at the same time, I was really living on the edge of my ability. It was a wonderful moment of just like, wow, that was great. That's a flow stage. Time seems to pass. It's just almost it seems to be no sense of time. But then you have traumatic moments or sheer terror, and that where just things stand still, or depression that drags on and on. I can't think who I was listening to recently, either podcast or YouTube or something, and somebody's talking about depression and how time just stands still and just doesn't seem to move on, and everything just becomes slow and dragging and stodgy. That's an experiential state of time. And then grief or loss, and how do you get through this? Does it ever go? Anticipation or anxiety. I don't have too many negative feelings, but probably anxiety of something that's out of my control, I find super annoying. Like, if you apply for a visa for a country and you have no say of whether that visa is going to get approved or not, like it all hangs on some bureaucrat sitting somewhere. That I find that so irritating because I'm somebody that likes to be in control of my life. And so in that moment, I can feel really tense because I'm predicting or I'm looking off into the future. And then, of course, major life transitions, whether that's a birth of a child or a divorce or getting married or death or whatever it might be, that changes your perception of time in that moment. Imprisonment, thankfully, something I've not experienced, but I can only guess that if you're imprisoned, it feels rather different from if you're roaming the wilderness of your local streets. Mindfulness or deep presence. meditation or just being somewhere, just being present to that place. Next week, I'm going on I'm trekking in Nepal by myself and just a guide. I decided not to go with a group, just me and a guide, because I really want to go into the mountains by myself and not be having to chit chat about life. You know, when you go with a group, you're just chit chat about stuff. And I was like, I'm in the mountains. I just want to be present. So for me, I really can't wait to get into this space of deep presence next week in the mountains and just think about life, think about myself, think about what I want to achieve and this sort of thing. And then boredom. Just when you're bored, it's not like depression or, you know, but it's got this kind of stodgy quality to it. You just want it to be over. Falling in love. You want that moment to last forever. Who wants to go from the beautiful romantic phase to the more, you know, well, maybe people do. As somebody 3 times divorced, well, twice divorced and 1 time separated, maybe I'm not the best model for why falling in love is the model for timelessness. Near-death experiences I've not had. My dad has. Maybe this is why he lives in the past. My dad was a scaffolder in Plymouth Dockyard, and he was on a scaffolding once, and a fellow scaffolder threw a bolt, like a massive metal bolt, at somebody to catch, and the person didn't catch it, and it went straight into my dad's eye, blinded him instantly. But he also nearly died. He dropped to the floor, and he remembers very clearly. My dad is totally not mystical or spiritual in any sense at all, but he says he remembers very clearly the feeling of being above his body and the feeling of peace that came upon him, feeling like that's it, no more struggle. And then boom, he was back into his body and rushed to the hospital and stuff. But that near-death experience, I can only dream what that must feel like. But you can certainly imagine what a timeless experience that must be like. And then finally, another one that I've not personally experienced, but no doubt people in this group have: psychedelic or altered states, whether that's magic mushrooms or LSD or whatever it might be. You know, I certainly, a friend of mine did DMT, is that what it's called? I think DMT. And I remember him talking about what an amazing experience it was for him and how he seemed to transcend this world into a kind of another place and met these pan-dimensional beings. And it changed his life because they said to him, it's going to be okay. And I've got no idea what that was, but what I do know is his relationship to time in that moment was fundamentally different from this Chronos version of time or the other Kairos versions here. I hope this is beginning to lay the foundations. I'm realizing as you listen to this, you might be thinking, well, I don't know what you're thinking, but you might be thinking, what's this got to do with coaching? So let's try to move this on into, okay, we get it, Nick. There's the experience of time and there's time itself. What does that mean to us as coaches? So I want to talk about Husserl's phenomenology of internal time consciousness. And Husserl talked about time in 3 ways. Primal impression, which is the immediate now. And by the way, when we think about the immediate now in coaching, what do we have? We only have one thing, which is literally what's happening in this room together. The immediate now is not what happened just before the session. It's what's happening right now. What's happening in my body, what's happening in your body, what's happening in my head, what's happening in your head, what's happening between us. That is the immediate now that in coaching we can access. Now, of course, in life, primal impression is whatever's happening in any given moment. But for you as coaches, what's happening between you is a vital, let's say, landscape for you to explore. I can't put it better than that, really. It's a landscape. It can be roamed over like a lion roaming over the fields of the Serengeti or whatever. You know, it has a lot of scope that I think coaches often miss. Some coaches get it; they really get it, and but a lot of coaches talk about the there and then most of the time. What's happening there and then? What will happen there and then? What's happening there in the future? What happened back then? And they forget there's an immediacy about what's happened between us. How am I feeling about what you're saying? How are you feeling about what you're saying? How do I relate to you? How do you relate to me? What might that relationship be saying about your experience of whatever that thing is you're being coached on? That is a primal impression conversation. And if any of you want to read a great book on that style of coaching, I would highly recommend Coaching Relationships by Eric DeHaan. He also wrote another great book called Relational Coaching, but I really think Coaching Relationships is the one to read if you're fascinated by how do I use this moment, this experience between us, such that if I accept that 2 people in a space in some way impact each other, then what I am feeling or experiencing is some way a reflection of what you're thinking and feeling. You know, we all know about mirror neurons and that sort of thing. So that primal impression that Husserl talks about for us as coaches is right there in the room or on the Zoom screen or on the cliff if you're doing outside walking, or whatever it is you're doing, or if you're Ruth in the garden with a client. Retention is the echo of the just past. This isn't childhood. This is what's just happened. And what echo is that leaving in this space right now? What is the emotion? What is the somatic feeling, the somatic response? What's echoing in this room according to what's just happened? That might be something that's happened just in this space, like between the coach and the client. It might be something that just happened. Like, sometimes you can do something as a coach and you think, oh, God, what did I just do? What did I just say? Did I just overstep the boundary? Well, why did I say that? Why did I ask that? And you can feel yourself kind of trying to wind back, but you can't wind back. But what you can do is go, let's take a look at it now. Let's have a primal impression, exploration of a retention. In other words, what just happened and how is it echoing still? Because you can feel it. I'm sure as coaches, you've all had that feeling of like something's changed in this relationship for the better or the worse. And sometimes changing it for the worse can mean it changes for the better because you get to address it. But either way, retention is an echo of the just past. Now, that could also be what's back there. What happened just before the coaching or yesterday or the day before, but it's a recency. It's something that's leaving a very current experience. And then protension is the anticipation of the next moment. Not what are you going to do, not what's the plan, not what you commit to, but how do you experience the anticipation of the next moment? In the run-up to these talks, I always think, what on earth are you doing, Nick? Why do you volunteer to do these lectures? You don't need to do them. Nobody forces you to do them. Why do you do them? Because about a half hour before the lecture, I just think, oh, this is going to be a nightmare. I'm going to be rubbish. All the content's going to be useless. I'm going to fumble over my words. The whole thing's going to be terrible. I always feel that, even though I've done these lectures over the years and years and years, and none of them have ever gone terribly, I hope. And yet I always have this protension, which is a kind of regret that I put myself in this situation. And yeah, I keep doing it because I know that it's important to me. So, if were I in a coaching session at this moment, you might explore, what does that experience mean to me? Do I use it positively, negatively? Does it matter? Do I just let it go? Et cetera, et cetera. Protension. I was anticipating this moment with you guys. So how could we coach with Husserl's model? Well, first of all, we tune into how the past shows up right now. What is showing up? What's echoing from what's gone in that client's life? Notice and draw out what's being anticipated. So when you're thinking about at the end of a session, typically as coaches, don't we? We tend to talk about, well, what are you taking from this session, or what might you do, or what's your next step, or what's your plan? Sink into the experience. How do you experience talking about that? Don't just go like, great, see you next week. I'm looking forward to hearing how you get on. Let's take a moment to sink into the experience of what you're expecting to do. How does it feel to think that's what you're about to do? How does it feel in your body? How does it feel in your mind? How do you think about it? What's the kind of the visceral experience of what we're talking about here? And then finally, grounded awareness in the present. We've talked about that already, but what's happening right here? So when we're coaching with Husserl's model, it's not difficult. It's just being aware. You can almost imagine it as like a contracted space of the immediate past, the immediate future, and the present. And how do we kind of bond these together into a molecule of exploration and really kind of get into what it all means for that client? So that's the first conceptual model. Let me pause for a second. I'm just going to pause and see if there are any reflections or questions coming up at this point. Yes, Melanie, please jump in. Not really. My approach wouldn't be that, but that doesn't mean that's not a good approach. In a way, there are two ways of thinking about working with paradigms. One is to be very explicit in working with paradigms, which is let's see if we can dig out the kind of the fundamental chunks of your paradigm, one of which is time, and one of which is agency, and one of which is meaning, and this sort of thing. Another way is to notice what comes up, what's happening in the space that might call upon a certain exploration. So there's no point exploring, in my opinion, there's no point exploring time for the sake of exploring time.
Mm-hmm.
It's more a case of does this thing that's been brought up seem to indicate a given relationship with time that's either problematic or opportunistic for them? And if so, let's bring it into the open. I think the key thing there really is having your radars or your antennae wiggling around for these sorts of things. As a transformative coach, if you're a performance coach, it might not be a thing. But as a transformative coach, you got your little antennae wiggling around for these moments of paradigmatic exploration. Annabelle, jump in, please. It's a great question. Bracketing doesn't necessarily mean not bringing yourself into it. It means not being attached to yourself in it. So, number one, I think coaching has matured an awful lot. So when I first started training as a coach, yes, nobody even talked about bracketing. That was way too complex a word for a coach to deal with. We just got the growth model thrown at us, and that was it. But in reality, bracketing is the idea is you don't bring your assumptions into the space, and nor do you bring what you perceive as truths into the space. Now, as coaching has matured, it's recognized that the relationship, the relational aspect of coaching is super important, and that the human being that is the coach is also a tuning fork to what might be going on systemically and interpersonally. So if you try to bracket that, you just become a robot. And coaching has recognized that. I mean, I think Eric DeHaan was definitely very much one of the kind of the leaders of the field of going, hey, relationships matter. And it wasn't like it was not like he discovered it. It came very much from psychotherapy, in particular psychoanalysis. So it's not like it's a new thing, but it's just coaches matured as a profession. And we realize that things are much more complex than being I'm bracketed and won't touch you in any shape or form. Now we recognize that's impossible. What we're trying to bracket though is our attachment to ourselves or our attachment to our rightness. There was something else I wanted to say briefly. Oh yes, I just wanted to resonate with Annabelle's kind of pretension anxiety about speaking. I'd be exactly the same unless I'm in charge of the thing, as in I'm the presenter, Annabelle. I really hate imposing myself into a space that I don't own. It's a horrible feeling because you just don't know how you're going to be received. So I totally get you. Resonate totally. Right, let's. So yeah, I wanted to just finish up with Husserl to say that and I think I've made this clear anyway, this is not about facts or events. So when we talk about protension or retention, it's not what happened or what will happen, it's how do you experience it. So it's feelings, it's the visceral feelings. And so we look at what's the experience of considering the just past or the immediate present or the next moment. Okay, let's now talk about Philip Zimbardo. Now, Philip Zimbardo was the psychologist who did that very famous Stanford prison experiment. They even made it into a film where they took a bunch of students and they made one half prisoners and one half prison wardens, and it descended into really shocking bullying and chaos very quickly to the point they had to abandon the experiment. It was a really fascinating case study. That was Philip Zimbardo. So I'm kind of hesitant to hold him up as a role model, but he actually wrote a beautiful book called The Time Paradox. And within that, he came up with this kind of time perspective theory, which I think offers us a very nice, very easy to understand framework from which we could think of. Now, we don't need to ascribe it some level of truth, but we can at least kind of go, right, this is an interesting framework for us to think about. And the way he looks at it is there are 6 relationships to time, which any given individual will have a preference for, not exclusively, but a preference for. And that preference will, generally speaking, govern their life. But it's not DNA based. It's cultural, it's learned, it's habitual, etc., etc. So these things can be shifted, which for us as coaches makes it a useful concept. If it can't be shifted, there's not much point, coaching on it other than acceptance. But Zimbardo's point is, yeah, these can be shifted, and it can be shifted in accordance to what is it you want to achieve, and how is your time perspective either supporting or holding that back. So the time perspectives are past positive. This would be my poor dad. He keeps getting it, doesn't he? But this would be my dad. Like my dad looks back at his childhood, 1950s, Oldham, Wigan, Rochdale, as this kind of beautiful nostalgic period of his life where he could have achieved anything, and he went to art school in London, and world would have been my oyster until I did this. And he remembers his past so much. But then we have the opposite of that, which is past negative. This is, of course, the place of things like unresolved trauma. And, my life can't move on because of my past. I did all these bad things, or bad things were done to me. don't know if any of you have read the book Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, but I'm re-listening to that. I've listened to it 3 times and I've listened to it again. I find that book wonderful. His childhood was just so terrible, and yet what he's gone on to achieve as an individual and what he had to get through to achieve it was just incredible. So Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, but he was stuck in a past negative mindset for much of his life until he turned it around. Fantastic book, very, very well worth reading or listening to. In fact, listen to it, it's even better because he contributes extra stuff to the audiobook. So past positive, past negative. Then we have present hedonistic. Impulsivity, pleasure seeking, risk taking. In a minute, I will confess where I sit on this. Generally speaking, where I sit. Present fatalistic. Like, there's no point doing anything. It's pointless. Nothing can be changed. What will be, que sera, sera. Even to some extent, everything happens for a reason. That is a phrase that a lot of people use, and I often wonder if they understand the implication of that. Everything happens for a reason. Sounds great, doesn't it? But it rather is fatalistic. It's usually used for a way to go like, well, it was bad, but it happened for a reason, so I'll see the positive in it. Yeah, that's really nice. But if you really take it at a meta level, everything happens for a reason comes from a particular belief system that is fatalistic. So it's going to lend itself to a kind of a fatalistic mentality potentially. And that's an interesting thing to start to pick up on. Figures of speech that clients use. Is it simply a figure of speech, or does it somehow represent a belief system that impacts how they live their life? And to what extent have they actually really thought about it? To what extent have they held that up to the light and said, well, if everything happens for a reason, how does that change how I live my life? Or how does it change how I am living my life? And then we have future-oriented, planning, ambition, delayed gratification, etc. And transcendental future, which is kind of like, well, this life is not really worth thinking about too much. I will focus on the afterlife or spiritual continuity or legacy. And legacy is clearly somewhat different. I would say that's future oriented, but it sits within that same sort of framework of being greater being greater or more transcendental of your identity than simply the life you live. That's the kind of legacy part. I remember reading Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it's a fantastic book. But I kind of think he copped out at the end. I don't know if any of you have read that book, but he cops out, in my opinion, because the whole book is about sort of like the meaninglessness of existence and the kind of what he would call the contingency of existence. But at the end, he realizes that if you create something like a song that outlives you, it gives meaning. I'm not entirely convinced it does, but I mean, it clearly outlives you, but whether it creates meaning is another thing. But, you could see that Sartre was contending with his atheism, the concept of existence precedes essence, which was a classic existential humanistic concept, and how that leaves him with no transcendent future. And you can see in this book Nausea how he's grappling with that, and it's a little bit like Descartes. You have the sense with Descartes that he sort of nearly got to a certain place and then rolled himself back, because of course he was a Christian living in the 17th century. He couldn't say what I think he really wanted to say. I mean, I might be wrong, but I kind of felt like he went that cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. He was right on the edge of saying something profoundly anti-religious and then wind himself back because he had to. I felt like Sartre did the same a little bit with existential thinking in Nausea. But anyway, that's Zimbardo's time perspective theory: past positive, past negative, present hedonistic, present fatalistic, future oriented, transcendental. Now, this is super useful when you start to kind of not so much map, because that sounds kind of logical and processified. I don't mean that. But you start to notice behaviors and where do they sit. So if I think of myself here, I am two of these things, in particular, two of them. I'm curious I'm not going to ask you, Ruth, but I'm curious if you could guess what they are. But I am 100% future oriented, no question. I live, and by the way, that when I talk about future oriented, I'm not talking about the kind of entrepreneurial planning future oriented. I live in the future to a sort of a silly degree, where I'm already excited about my next trip rather than enjoying the one I'm on. So I'm kind of like, here I am in Cambodia, or here I am in Laos, or here I am and I'm planning the flight to Vietnam, or I'm planning and I'm already thinking about when I'm in the Philippines. It's like, just stay present, Nick, and enjoy where you are. But I'm really bad. I get a lot of pleasure from imagining where I'm going to be in a week's time or 2 weeks' time, like very, very future oriented, protension to the max, like anticipating what's coming next, much more so than appreciating here, because I'm not very present oriented in the sense I'm not good at being, appreciate what's in front of you. But where I do sit with the present here is the present hedonistic, because I am very impulsive. I don't think very far ahead with risks. It's why I've got married 3 times. It's, it's all these silly things. It's why I take risks that pay off and sometimes don't pay off. I don't really worry too much about stuff because I'm present hedonistic. So if somebody's coaching me, knowing that I am both future oriented, particularly in the short term, I have no legacy. I've got no legacy kind of orientation. It's all very much, and I'm hedonistic in the sense that I enjoy the moment of taking risk, not so much the moment of doing something. That is a useful understanding of me if one were to coach me, because it starts to inform what's driving my ideas, what's driving my plans, what's driving my inhibitions, and all this sort of thing. So having kind of laid out the groundwork, how do we start to coach with the time perspective theory? Well, the first thing to do is to try to identify it. And again, this isn't saying, hey, we're going to identify your time perspective. It's noticing what do they talk about. Do they talk about the past? And if they do talk about the past, do they talk about it positively or negatively? Do they talk about the present and how much they're enjoying it? Or do they talk about the present in the sense of like, well, there's nothing I can do. Look at the state of the economy. Look at the state of this. Look at the state of that. What can I do for myself? Are they stuck in the fatalistic way? Or are they talking about the future? Oh, when I do this, I'm gonna. By the way, I think there's a third one, which is kind of, I don't know what you'd call this. I should really think of a label for this, but it's when the future takes over your activities. Like, when I achieve this, I'll be happy. When I get this, I'll be successful. When it's like, no. You can be happy today and still achieve something. That might be an interesting thing to add to Zimbardo's model. It's like some sort of future orientation that almost prevents you feeling something today. Anyway, number 1, identify the dominant time orientation that the client might be beginning to reveal, the choices they make, the stories they tell, etc., etc. Then you could begin to explore the costs, the benefits, the outcomes of that current perspective. How does it serve them to live in that world? Maybe it does. Maybe it's fantastic. Maybe it really, really is where they need to be. Or maybe it's like holding them back so badly that they have this kind of anxiety of the past, or such a bad sense of what the past did to them or what the future might hold, and so on. And then you can explore options for change and or acceptance. Now, this was the reason why I put the and or acceptance here. Is I was thinking about my lecture I did was it last month, 2 months ago, Human All Too Human, and this idea of the paradox of change. And what I've realized is I often felt bad that I was looking ahead so much. Like, Nick, just enjoy where you are. Stop thinking about your next trip. But I realized I get pleasure now thinking about the future. So it's kind of a win-win if you think about it. I have a pleasure in the moment because I'm not delaying the pleasure. The pleasure is in the planning, and the pleasure is in the thinking about, and the pleasure is in the anticipation. So it's a present moment experience of a future thing. And and for a long time I kept thinking, become more present, Nick. And now I've realized, no, I can accept it as a part of my makeup. Now, could I change it? Of course I could change it, but do I want to? No, I get a lot of pleasure from it. And so I think there's something about helping clients, A, see it, and B, if it's not detrimental to their life, learning to accept it rather than push against it all the time. Because I do think as people in a given culture, we are taught certain things. And there's been an obsession on the now for a long time. Ever since Eckhart Tolle wrote The Power of Now, there's been this kind of obsession with be in the now, be in the present. And I'm not convinced that's necessarily true. I think it's what serves you, or in coaching, what serves your client. If thinking about the future serves them, great. I also would say, by the way, that what I have changed a lot is my risk taking. I've become much better at going, take a pause. In fact, I wrote a list of life lessons, one of which was to slow down my decision making. Just before I left the UK, I bought an apartment in Kingston upon Thames for my wife and I to move to. And then a few months later, I was like, I think I need to leave the UK and separate from my wife and all this kind of stuff. But I was locked into this blinking purchase. And as a result, by the time I sold it, I lost 140,000 quid in 3 months. Because by the time it was built, it was no way worth what I paid for it. That was a stupid decision. I should have taken my time. So there's something about, like, for me, changing the hedonistic, what's the one? The hedonistic, yeah, present hedonistic, because I tend to take risks way too easily. So change that, but accept my future orientation. By the way, I hope it's okay to share all these silly little personal stories I do. It just helps me think. When I think about myself, it helps me think about what I'm saying. And then finally, experiment with reframing. And we're going to come to a wonderful way to reframe shortly, but just experiment with the reframing. What would it be like if you thought about the past, or how might you think about the past differently, or how might you think about the future differently, or what would change if, da, 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 da. You know, for any of you who do the Animas program, we talk about the multiple perspectives. And one of those is the time context reframe. I don't know if we still teach it. I haven't taught the course for a long time, but it used to be called a time context reframe, which was, if you think about this over a period of years rather than weeks, how would that change things? You can do that with this, a time context reframe. Okay, we're going to talk about some practical coaching approaches which aren't about those two models now, just in general. I'm conscious of time. I did say we'd be about an hour. I think it'll be slightly over, but not too much more. So some practical coaching approaches. Well, first of all, phenomenological inquiry, you can't go wrong with. What does that mean? It simply means describing the experience without analyzing. It means having the client surface the experience they have without going, that means you are this kind of person, or have them say, that means I'm this kind of person. Just allow them to open up. This is how I feel when. This is what I think when. This is how my body reacts when. You don't need to figure out what that means. You're just allowing the experience to come to the surface. If we do phenomenological inquiry, we're always describing, not interpreting. Now, the interpretation can happen, but first you surface it. Going back to the point earlier, bracketing your assumptions. And if we go into this thinking, I'm going to find Zimbardo's time perspective for this client, we're already holding them within a given framework that might not be right for them. So instead, phenomenological inquiry, let it come to the surface as it is without interpretation, and then we begin to figure out what's going on. Then you could share and explore. So I know often as coaches we're taught not to do this, but let's be honest, if you're doing transactional analysis work, it's hard to do that without, to some degree, sharing an idea of ego states and so on. And you can do the same with this. Hey, is it okay if I share this model of how we live through time? Here's the model, 6 time perspectives, or the protension, retention, etc. Let's look at it together. The client's still owning the process. The client's still owning the outcome. You're just sharing a model that can be useful for them to work with. And then awareness and appreciation. Again, going back to my paradox of change, just bringing this stuff to awareness and allowing the client to appreciate, A, that's who I am, and B, that's what I'm okay with, is a perfectly fantastic. Is that sounds like almost like a superlative that doesn't need to be made. It's a perfect way to enable coaching to happen. And then narrative coaching, using narrative coaching to reframe the story. What's the plot that's being told here? And how might that plot be different if the future changes or the past changes? Or how might you tell that story differently, such that the story here is no longer the story you thought it was? I've got to say, even though David Goggins is not a coach, the way he's done this for himself is incredible. His ability to reframe his life, to realize what his childhood could have meant to him in a different way, incredible. And then somatic awareness, get the client to tune into the embodied sense of time, the embodied sense of the experience of what this means. How does time feel? I remember when I did this lecture, similar lecture, 2015, I started off the lecture. We were back in those days, it was in person. So we had a proper hotel room and everyone was sitting. And I played 3 different kind of clocks. The first one was like, the next one was like, and the next one was like loads of different bells, all chiming different speeds, some bong, bong, bong. And I asked the audience to say which one seemed to speak to them most about their experience of time. Not their concept of time, but their experience of time. It was amazing to see how many people tuned into the fast one or the slow one or the one that just felt like pure chaos. That's a somatic awareness of time. And then, of course, you can work, if you're a mindfulness coach, you can work on expanding the present through mindfulness. One of my greatest weaknesses, I have to say. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to share with you in a second, this is one I wouldn't say I invented it, but it's like, this is what I talked about in 2015. And I use flip charts to show how you can do it in a very you could use pieces of paper in coaching to do this. And that's to play with the linearity and causation. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So to play with linearity and causation, we think of time as being linear from past to present to future, and each of those causes the next. The past causes the present causes the future. Makes sense. Very Newtonian. Would make sense that that is how it works. And to some degree, it is how it works in a physical sense. But it doesn't have to be how it works in a mental sense, because what we are always living in is the present. The past doesn't exist at all, nor does the future. You only have the present. So what you do in the present can affect the causation flow. So here's the classic causation: past, present, future. This happened to me as a child, which means that now I'm doing this, which means my future looks like that. What if we do this though? We ask the client to put the future first. So if this is the future that you hope for or that you want, how does that reshape the past you've had? How is the past reshaped from a meaning perspective, not a events perspective, because you can't change the events. The past is gone, but you can change the meaning it's given in relationship to the future the client wants. So if that's the future, how does that reshape, or how could you allow yourself to reshape the past in order for that future to come? And then how does that impact the present? What needs to be happening now? How might you feel now? And again, going back to, I don't mean to advocate for David Goggins all of a sudden, but if you look at Goggins, that's what he did. He reshaped his past meaning by saying the abuse he received as a child, which was unbelievably intense, hardened him to become the person that he wants to be for the future. So he took the future as the starting point and said, well, if that's my starting point, what do I do? Well, how does that change my past? And how does that then change my present? Equally, you could then go from the present to the future to the past, which is, here's my present. How do I feel? How do I genuinely feel? Not what am I projecting as an illusion, but what do I really, really feel if I'm honest with myself? Let me tune into, because, sometimes, I know we never feel this, but plenty of clients will feel uncertain about what they actually want. We are super clear, I know that, but a lot of clients will feel uncertain. So getting present into be super honest with yourself about what you actually want rather than projecting some illusion. Then you go, okay, well, if that's what I really feel now, how does that shape my future? And if that's the future, how do I remake the past? And back in 2015, I did that with flip charts, and you could literally write a story in 3 different places and move them to see how they would affect each other. There's nothing to stop you doing that very creatively with whether it's pieces of paper or whatever you want to do. It doesn't really matter. The point here, allow yourself to change the order of the flow of time. Okay, finally, let's get to the transformative impact. Wow, I'm pretty much on time. First of all, and this is a big thing for me, as you'll know from my talk that I did on gods and playthings, looking at personal agency. When you allow a client to become aware of and have a different relationship with their time, they gain more agency, and agency equals choice, and choice equals change. So immediately you have a transformative impact at the very, very, very base in a foundational level. It can also create a greater appreciation of the self. And what I mean by that is not I like myself better, but an understanding of the self. Why do I behave the way I do? What is it about my way of thinking that means that I do what I do? It can obviously reframe limiting temporal narratives. It can reconnect people to their meaning and the purpose. If you change your future, or you change what the past means to you, it can change the way you think of your whole purpose. If you think about something like Viktor Frankl and how he changed the meaning of the concentration camp, that's very much what you might think of as a sort of a temporal realignment. And then embrace Kairos moments as hard as it can be. Become present to those temporal moments where things feel challenging or exciting. And if you're in flow, suddenly appreciate the flowness, or appreciate the flowness after you come out of it, whatever it might be. But try to help clients embrace the Kairos moments. By the way, just for those of you who might be quickly taking notes, we will send out this PDF in some way to you guys who attended. Finally, some reflective questions to ask yourself. What are your dominant time perspectives? Just try to think that through. Where do you find yourself leaning, and does it serve you? When does time seem to fly? When does it drag? And what does that reveal about you, or about the world, or about the people you mix with? Do you find yourself dwelling on the past, living in the present, or projecting into the future? How do you relate to the idea of mortality or the long view of your life? I'm not going to say anything more about that one, but for me, that's always been a very important one. Given that I was brought up an atheist, I've always had this understanding of, for me, the shortness of life and the longness too. You don't want to live a terrible, boring life. And then what is your earliest memory of feeling time deeply? Just think back. When do I remember really experiencing time? Was it when you were a child? Was it an adult? What did it mean to you? What was the experience like? And then finally, what habits or choices are shaped by your perception of time? So just some questions to leave you with. And again, we'll send out these slides afterwards. And on that note, let me stop sharing the screen and come back to you, because we're going to wrap up now. So thank you. So I'm going to take some questions, but let me say thank you very much for being here. But let me see if there are any reflections or questions before we close off. Yes, Johnny. I would imagine, Johnny, that if you did a deep analysis of that stuff, there'd probably be some correlation, I would imagine, between what we might define as success, whether that's societal success or internal happiness success, I'd imagine. But I would hesitate myself, with very, very limited ideas other than my human experience, to assume that's the case. So I wouldn't say that. I can imagine it's the case, but I also wouldn't guess at it, because my natural assumption would be yes, and it's this, but I might be completely wrong. And there might be somebody else in this group who's like, get lost, Nick. That's the opposite of what I would say. And that's right. They would think that. So unless there's some proper longevity study done on this, I wouldn't really. What matters is what the client experiences. Does their time perspective serve the client? And that's really all that matters. Is that Divan? My eyesight's a little bit dodgy. Divan. Honestly, I don't really have much of an opinion on that, Divan, because I don't feel like I keep my finger on the pulse of people in general. I know my own pulse, let's say, but I don't have a good, like, my guess would be there was a definite obsession with the now, and I almost feel like that's sort of moving into the past a little bit, but I might be wrong. That, there was a huge time where Eckhart Tolle was the only things people spoke about, and mindfulness became like the thing, didn't it? And there was like the monk who sold his Ferrari, and there's all this stuff. You don't really see much of that, in my opinion, but I might be wrong, because I don't really keep my finger on the pulse of that sort of work anymore. My feeling is no, I feel like it's become very future oriented. And I think people become either very positive about the future, like I am, or very anxious about the future. It almost feels like there's an overemphasis on the future now rather than the present. But that's honestly, that's a very, 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 very limited like worldview based on tiny sliver. And also I'm traveling through Southeast Asia, which has a very, very different culture in terms of its relationship to time than the West does. And I'm sort of, I see a lot of the news from the UK, and I'm thinking, wow, what's going on over there? It feels very different, but I don't, whether it's just an illusion, I really don't know. So I can't give you a good answer, Divan, apart from, come up with your own hypothesis and just see if it plays out for fun. Well, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, your questions, really, really nice questions, really great questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate it a lot. And I will see you. I don't think I've got my next topic planned, have I? I don't think I have. So I will see you. Oh, no, I know what it is. In June, I'm not going to be doing a lecture. It's going to be Nick Thorpe doing a lecture on something to do with shadow and emergence. So that's going to be in June. So look out for that. And I think in May we got a talk on emergence within team coaching with Georgina Woodster and Allard de Jong. So check that out on the website. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, etc. And see you again soon. Thanks a lot.